A colony can die surrounded by food. That single fact, quiet, documented and still widely misunderstood, sits at the center of what beekeepers have called winter starvation for centuries. But starvation is not always the cause. Sometimes the honey is there. Sometimes it is capped, sealed, and stored inches from a cluster of bees that will not survive to reach it. Have you experienced this in your own hives? Opened a dead colony in February or March and found honey still present? If this kind of biological detail matters to you, a like helps this channel reach more beekeepers who think the same way. This is not a modern problem. It is not a product failure. Historical records from the 19th century, from Langstroth's own observations, from European wintering manuals, from accounts written by careful beekeepers across the American Midwest, all describe the same scene. Dead cluster, full frames nearby. No obvious explanation. For generations, beekeepers attributed it to disease, to queen failure, or to simple bad luck. What was actually happening is a matter of colony biology, and it has a name: isolation starvation. What most beekeepers misunderstand is this: the bees did not run out of honey. The colony lost the biological capacity to reach it. To understand why a colony freezes with honey still inside, it is necessary to understand how a winter cluster actually functions, not as a dormant mass, but as a living, regulated thermal system. When ambient temperatures drop below approximately 57 degrees Fahrenheit, a honeybee colony begins to contract. Bees leave the outer frames and pull toward the center of the hive body. As temperatures fall further below 45 degrees, the cluster tightens. The outer shell of bees becomes a dense, insulating layer. The inner core maintains a sustained temperature, often between 68 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on whether brood is present. Through continuous muscular thermogenesis, bees vibrate their thoracic muscles without moving their wings. Heat generated at the core moves outward. Outer bees cycle inward, and the cluster breathes as a single regulated unit. Cluster size. That is the variable that determines whether this system holds. A colony entering winter with fewer than 5 or 6 full frames of bees, roughly 10,000 to 15,000 individuals, has a severely limited thermal mass. A small cluster cannot generate and sustain enough interior heat to remain functional when temperatures drop sharply, and when that cluster's thermal capacity is exceeded by cold, it locks. It tightens so completely that lateral movement becomes physiologically impossible. Strong cluster, immobile cluster. These are not contradictions. They are the same biological event at different temperature thresholds. Here is where seasonal timing matters more than most beekeepers account for. The winter cluster does not remain stationary. It moves slowly, incrementally upward through the frames, consuming honey as it goes. That upward movement is not random. It follows heat. The bees move toward the slightly warmer zone just above the cluster's thermal core, consuming stored honey frame by frame in a slow, sustained progression through winter. But that movement requires a thermal threshold to remain possible. If external temperatures drop fast enough, and the cluster has already consumed the honey immediately surrounding it, the bees face a gap, a cold gap, sometimes only 2 or 3 inches of uncapped space, or a single empty frame positioned between the cluster and the next honey store, becomes an uncrossable distance. The bees will not scatter to find food. Cold, contracted bees do not forage within the hive the way they would in warmer conditions. They hold position. They consume whatever remains within direct cluster reach. And when that is gone, they die, even if the next frame over is full. Dead cluster. Honey untouched. The same scene recorded in the same language across 2 centuries of wintering accounts. This phenomenon was observed and partially described well before modern apiology formalized it. 19th century beekeepers in Northern Europe, particularly in regions of Germany and Scandinavia, where winters were severe and extended, noted in their wintering records that colonies with what they described as adequate stores still perished. Some attributed the losses to moisture, others to ventilation. A small number of careful observers recorded something more specific. They noted the position of the dead cluster in relation to remaining honey and documented that the cluster had never reached it. Lorenzo Lorraine Langstroth, writing in the mid-1800s, emphasized that the position of stores relative to the cluster was not incidental. He argued for placing winter provisions directly above the cluster, not beside it, not below it, but immediately above the point where the cluster would rest through the coldest months. His reasoning was practical, but it was grounded in an intuition about how the cluster moved or failed to move that anticipated what later thermal research would confirm. By the early 20th century, Wintering manuals published through American agricultural extension programs began explicitly identifying isolation starvation as a distinct failure mode, differentiated from true starvation by one diagnostic sign: honey remaining in the hive at the time of colony death. If you value biology-based beekeeping, consider subscribing. The insight from that era, and it remains as structurally sound today as it was then, is that honey quantity is only one variable, honey position is the other. A colony wintered on 2 deep hive bodies with 60 to 80 pounds of honey, distributed evenly across both boxes, is not automatically secure. If the cluster begins winter in the lower box, surrounded by honey on the sides and below, it will begin moving upward as it consumes. But if there is a gap, an empty frame, a frame of pollen without honey, or a frame that was never fully drawn between the cluster's natural upward path and the next available honey, that gap can become lethal during a sustained cold snap. The temperature threshold matters precisely here. At 40 degrees Fahrenheit, most clusters will not freely move more than a few inches from their thermal core. At 32 degrees, movement stops almost entirely. The cluster becomes a fixed biological system. It will survive or it will not, based entirely on what honey is within its immediate reach at that moment. This is why beekeepers who use a single deep body with honey concentrated directly above the cluster, as Langstroth and later European wintering specialists consistently recommended, sometimes outperform those managing heavier total stores but with less deliberate frame positioning. More honey, worse placement. That combination has ended colonies for as long as beekeepers have been keeping winter records. There is a secondary factor that receives far less attention: the viscosity of capped honey under extreme cold. Honey at winter temperatures becomes significantly thicker, significantly harder to extract from capped cells. Bees already operating near their thermal minimum face increased physical effort at the exact moment their energy reserves are most constrained. The biological cost compounds quietly over weeks. Most colony loss attributed to late winter starvation is this kind of compounding failure, not a single catastrophic event, but a slow cascade in which a cluster too small to maintain adequate heat, positioned below a thermal gap, consuming increasingly viscous honey with diminishing reserves, reaches a point from which recovery is no longer possible. The bees hold cluster until the end. They do not disperse. They do not abandon the hive. They hold exactly where their biology instructs them to hold. This brings the question back to autumn management, specifically to the size and composition of the overwintering cluster at the moment of final autumn inspection. A strong colony entering winter in northern latitudes should ideally hold between 20,000 and 30,000 bees. That population mass provides thermal redundancy. Even during severe cold snaps, a cluster of that density maintains interior temperatures and has enough bees cycling through shell positions to sustain upward movement when conditions allow. A colony at 10,000 bees or fewer, which can result from a late-season swarm, from significant varroa-driven population collapse, or from a queen failure that was not identified in time, does not have that redundancy. Its cluster is smaller, its thermal mass is reduced, and its window of safe movement within the hive narrows considerably. The gap that a large cluster might bridge on a mild January afternoon becomes an uncrossable barrier for a colony at half that size. The historical recommendation, still structurally sound, was to assess colony strength not by the weight of stores alone, but by the number of frames covered with bees at the time of the final autumn inspection. The target was 6 to 8 frames of bees in a single deep body, or their equivalent across a 2-deep configuration. Colonies below that threshold were considered high risk for winter regardless of how much honey they were carrying. The mistake that appears repeatedly in both historical and contemporary accounts is this: beekeepers hefting hives in late autumn, confirming adequate weight, and closing up for winter without inspecting cluster position or cluster size. Weight tells a beekeeper how much honey exists in the hive. It does not tell them where the cluster sits in relation to that honey, or whether the cluster is large enough to reach it under sustained cold. Weight is a necessary check. It is not a sufficient one. Narrow window. Autumn decision. These facts do not change with equipment. What does this mean in practice? At the final autumn inspection, ideally conducted while ambient temperatures are still above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, to allow some cluster movement and frame assessment, the goal is not only to confirm honey stores but to assess cluster position and frame layout simultaneously. If the cluster is sitting low in the hive body, and honey is stored above it with any empty or partially drawn frames in between, those frames need to be addressed before final closure. Empty drawn comb can be repositioned to the outside edges of the box, away from the cluster's upward path. Partially filled frames can be moved outward. Frames of solid capped honey belong directly above and flanking the cluster's expected position. If the colony is overwintering on 2 boxes, confirming that the upper box holds the majority of honey stores, particularly in the frames directly above where the cluster will sit through January and February, reduces the risk of the cluster being stranded below an empty zone in the coldest part of winter. In historical practice, particularly in colder northern climates, some beekeepers went further. Early wintering manuals described a specific arrangement they called food contact, ensuring that the cluster's top surface was in direct physical contact with capped honey at the moment of final hive closure. Not honey nearby, not honey in the box above, separated by any gap. Honey the cluster could consume without vertical movement at all. This arrangement provided a baseline reserve that required no cluster mobility to access, preserving the colony's energy through the most dangerous thermal window, at temperatures consistently below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That distinction in frame arrangement is frequently the difference between a colony that survives to February and one that does not. There is one additional variable that interacts with cluster mobility: moisture accumulation inside the hive during winter. A tightly closed hive with poor upper ventilation accumulates condensation. That condensation chills the cluster surface, raising the thermal cost of maintaining interior temperatures and further reducing the cluster's capacity for controlled movement. Bees expending energy to counteract external moisture have less thermal margin available for the controlled upward movement that winter survival requires. Early 20th century American wintering literature frequently referenced upper ventilation, a small upper entrance left open, or a thin shim placed under the inner cover, as a means of allowing moisture-laden air to escape without creating a draft across the cluster itself. The principle was to manage the humidity gradient within the hive, not to ventilate the cluster directly. The interaction is this: excess moisture raises the thermal load on the cluster, reduces its effective operating range, and tightens the biological margin between a colony that can move and one that cannot. It does not cause isolation starvation directly, but it removes the buffer that might otherwise allow a cluster to bridge a small gap on a mild afternoon in January. The intervention window is narrow. Once sustained cold sets in, once the cluster is locked and a gap has been established between it and remaining stores, there is very little a beekeeper can do without disturbing the cluster and risking greater harm from the disruption itself. Emergency feeding in deep winter is possible, but it is an imprecise correction applied after the failure has already begun. The decisions that prevent isolation starvation are autumn decisions. By December, in most northern climates, the opportunity to correct frame arrangement has passed. This is not a problem that can be reliably solved midwinter. It is a problem that must be understood in September and acted on before final closure in October or early November. The season sets the deadline. For beekeepers who lose colonies in winter and find honey remaining, the diagnostic process matters, not only for understanding what happened, but for improving the management decisions made the following autumn. When a dead colony is opened in late winter, the position of the dead cluster in relation to remaining honey tells a precise story. A cluster found at the bottom of the lower hive body, with full frames of honey in the upper box and no indication the cluster ever moved upward, indicates positional failure, a small cluster, a thermal gap, or inadequate food contact at the time of final closure. A cluster found at the very top of the upper box, surrounded by empty cells, having consumed everything on its upward path, is true starvation. The stores were insufficient for the length of that winter. These are different failures with different corrections. Conflating them produces the wrong response. Adding more honey stores to a colony that needed frame repositioning, or repositioning frames for a colony that genuinely needed more total winter feed. Historical wintering logs kept by careful beekeepers in the early 20th century included exactly this kind of post-mortem notation. Recording where the cluster died in relation to remaining stores was how those beekeepers, over multiple winters, built a working model of their specific climate, their specific equipment, and their colony's characteristic wintering behavior. The discipline of diagnosis informed the discipline of prevention. A colony does not freeze with honey still inside because of poor genetics, bad luck, or unexplained failure. It freezes because a biological system, precise, temperature-dependent, constrained by cluster size and thermal physics, was asked to function without the spatial conditions it requires to do so. The bees are doing exactly what their biology instructs. They are holding cluster, generating heat, and waiting for conditions that allow movement. When those conditions do not come before the last of the reachable honey is consumed, the colony ends quietly, surrounded by what it needed, but separated from it by a gap that cold made permanent. Understanding this changes how autumn inspections are conducted. It shifts the focus from quantity to position, from total weight to frame arrangement, from how much honey exists to whether the bees can physically reach it when temperatures are at their lowest. That shift, small in practice, significant in outcome, is what separates adequate winter preparation from reliable winter preparation. If this breakdown was useful, leave a comment with your experience. Subscribe for more historically grounded beekeeping insights.